The little that I am, the little that I am hoping to be, I owe to the socialist movement. It has given me my ideas and ideals, my principles and convictions, and I would not exchange one of them for all of Rockefeller's blood-stained dollars. It has taught me how to serve, a lesson to me of priceless value. It has taught me the ecstasy in the handclasp of a comrade. It has enabled me to hold high communion with you, and made it possible for me to take my place side by side with you in the great struggle for the better day, to multiply myself over and over again, to thrill with a fresh-born manhood, to feel life truly worthwhile, to open new avenues of vision, to spread out glorious vistas, to know that I am kin to all that throbs, to be class conscious, and to realize that regardless of nationality, race, creed, color, or sex, every man, every woman who toils, who renders useful service, every member of the working class without exception, is my comrade, my brother and sister, and that to serve them in their cause is the highest duty of my life.
Oh, hey everyone, how are you? This is kind of an episode of Stay at Home. We initially were going to have David Kalnitsky talk about the economics of a feasible socialism, what a full socialism could look like, but it didn't seem like this was the day for that kind of optimism, because our campaign for not even full socialism, but half social democracy has kind of petered out as of today. So obviously we all heard the news at 11:45 today when Bernie said that he was ending his campaign in his speech. We've heard the initial takes, and today we're joined by a few people. So we have Meagan joining us a little bit later, and for now we have Michael Brooks and we have Matt Karp, who I guess none of them really need introductions, but Meagan has a new book out now. About where we go after Bernie Sanders, bigger than Bernie. Michael Brooks, we're going to announce this tomorrow, but we already teased in the email blast. I think it's worth saying that he's going to be doing some shows for us on the Jacobin YouTube channel, which we'll talk about more tomorrow. And, Matt Karp is just kind of around. He's a Princeton historian who sometimes goes slumming and writes some angry Jacobin polemics from time to time, but there's some of my favorite pieces on the site. So I guess we're all here to not only just talk about the bad thing that just happened, and not only just talk about why we're disappointed that we came so damn close to actually winning something, but we fell a little bit short, but also talk about how Bernie Sanders really transformed a lot of American politics in the past 5 years, and how he's put us in a much, much better position to go forward in the next 5 years. So before we get to the leftists, I'm wondering whether we could have Chris Matthews on the line.
That's a really natural transition.
But Michael, tell me, what are you thinking about the last 5 years, this kind of whirlwind? I don't know what you were expecting when Sanders announced his first campaign, and it seems like we're in both a stronger position, but obviously it's kind of like found money. This whole campaign was found money, but now we lost that found money. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I want to strike a balance as best as possible right now between the fact that, of course, some strides have been made in the last 5 years. A lot of that thanks to Bernie Sanders. I also think it's very important that we, this is not a time to trash Bernie. Bernie's actually usually been and probably still remains more popular than the left. And has done a lot of significant work. It doesn't mean that we can't critique and analyze the campaign, which needs to happen, and people need to be comfortable doing that. Now we're in as this is happening, we're getting propelled into times that are, of course, really horrible and very damaging for a lot of people's lives. And, none of us would want that, and there's no guarantee in terms of how it plays out. However, because of necessity, there's going to be a whole other section of people that might very well be interested in this kind of politics, because it's the only kind of politics that has an answer to what they're experiencing, right? Like, even, the rate of people losing their health coverage alone really changes the contours of the conversation and even the kind of fear mongering about Medicare for all. I think we need to really assess what went right, what went wrong in this campaign. I think that maybe the focus right now specifically and the most important sites are actually some of the sort of strike and labor movement energy that is emerging right now. And I think, again, we have to recognize the real momentum, but also recognize the real mistakes so that we can refine and hone our game.
So, Matt, a lot of your writing in Jacobin over the past few months have focused on this question of what is the Bernie Sanders coalition? How can we expand it? How do we build a base of irregular and semi voters? You and Meagan, wrote a piece on this in December. I guess, why did we not kind of win over those voters? Why weren't we able to mobilize? And is there, obviously, we don't really have a simple answer right now, but what are your best, guesses at this point?
Yeah, it's such a strange time. It's a strange day. I mean, this whole month has been, we've lived a decade since, the Nevada primary in, 5 weeks. And it's just been, each week has brought a whole new set of sort of cataclysms to try to assimilate and understand. And in some ways, because Bernie's dropping out now, and in some ways the campaign faced defeat, the campaign's path to victory was pretty narrow for the past couple of weeks. The temptation in some ways is to sort of rush to the analysis, because we've been kind of mourning in some partial way, at least I have been assimilating some of these defeats since early March. But I also think there should be at least a moment today, even before we get into the analysis of what went wrong, just to sort of take a step back and swallow and appreciate specifically even this 2020 campaign and how it got here, almost just on an emotional level. Bhaskar, you talked about found money. On New Year's Eve, 2015 or something, I found $60 on the sidewalk outside of Astor Place, and I immediately purchased liquor with it. Now that liquor is gone, but that liquor contributed to a significantly enhanced New Year's Eve night that evening. So we haven't lost that liquor. That liquor is in us. It is part of us. It goes on with us. And I think in a really serious way, to come back to try to attempt to answer your question, I mean, we're going to do a lot of sober analysis.
Later.
Oh, sorry.
We could also answer this question later. We could stick.
Okay.
I'll
just.
You're right. You're right. Meagan, cheer me up. Where were you when the Bernie campaign in 2016, kicked off? What has this meant for you? What has this meant for so many of the other people in DSA on the left, who are just, much less than millions of other people who are just getting engaged in the political process because they're inspired by Bernie Sanders?
Right. I mean, I don't like that the task falls to me to cheer you up, because, I'm just as depressed as anybody else about the whole thing. But, obviously we saw this potentially coming from a mile off. In fact, I've envisioned this day many times and had plans for, heartfelt, Facebook posts I would make, none of which I have made, because instead I'm actually just reeling like everybody else. But, I did sit down and I wrote a piece for Jacobin. I have no idea if it's up yet. If it isn't, it will be momentarily. And I tried to capture some of my thoughts. And I did focus on that question of where was I when Bernie Sanders announced that he was running for president in 2015. I don't know where I was. I wasn't paying attention to national politics. I really wasn't. I had, in college, I had known student radicals. It's not like I was completely unfamiliar with the left, but I was also going about my business and reading literature and playing music and not paying attention to national politics at all. And something changed very significantly in 2016. And one thing that I try to remind people is that I joined DSA, and so did everybody else who joined during that bump, not because Bernie was running for president, but because Bernie Sanders lost the primary to Hillary Clinton. So I think that we should just dwell on that for a minute. The dynamics of people who are angry and who feel like they don't have a political home, but who are also awakened and impassioned and are looking for a place to put their energies. Those people have to go somewhere. In fact, there's a lot of chatter online right now about where they will go. And there's a very alive question right now about should Bernie Sanders mount an independent run? I mean, he's not going to. But I think that people are really interested in having that conversation, and that indicates it's sort of the tip of the iceberg of the phenomenon where people are looking for a place to go next. I hope that people will join the Democratic Socialists of America for one real reason, which is that DSA is a democratic organization. All of these people need to go to a place where they can engage in political education and decide together what they want to do. And DSA, no matter what you think of it at all, I happen to think that it's wonderful. Some people don't. It literally doesn't matter. It is a vessel that people can flood into that embodies the highest ideals of the Bernie Sanders campaign. And it's a democratic organization where people can make decisions together about what they want to do next. I think that we probably are set to see another membership bump. I would be surprised and disappointed if it didn't happen. And I also want to say that since 2015, people like me and many, many other people that I know, people that I've learned from, have become serious and committed, but non-sectarian socialists. The term from the olden days for these types of people is cadre, and historically they've actually been very important to American and international politics. So that heartens me that that's already happened, and I'm hoping that it'll have an exponential effect, even if it's not automatically or immediately visible the way that a national political campaign is.
So, no, I mean, I, for one, I'm just, I've been in DSA since 2007, and at various moments it's frustrated me to no end. But I'm glad that it exists now, because we need institutions. And Michael, one thing we talked about in the past on your show was this idea that Sanders, for all of his incredible strengths, hasn't had the best track record with institution building, even though he's tried to do these things. It's not like he's taken the pose of just saying, it's just me, just my campaign. Our revolution didn't quite live up to its potential. And I feel
me.
Yep. I feel like, I don't know, we might be trapped in this middle ground where we are not quite the mass force we want to be, but we're no longer a little sectarian force. And in a way, at least when you're a little sectarian force, you know that you're small. Or the good sectarians know that they're small and marginal. What are your kind of thoughts about how we actually keep this base going, and how we regroup not just the socialist left, but we bring in people who are more attracted to anti-establishment left populism, more attracted to just even just kind of non-ideological, don't have a label, but do believe in Sanders egalitarian kind of politics.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where we also have to be really, really careful right now about, I guess, acknowledging that this is an enormous setback. This is a very serious defeat. This is actually pretty bad. And there's no doubt that the terrain of what is politically viable and what's in the conversation has absolutely changed in the last several years. I think one of the things we actually need to start doing is recognizing the necessity and the importance of that accomplishment, but also just its raw limits. Like, yes, it's awesome. Medicare for all is a discussed policy option. What is the strategy to actually achieving it? Now, institutionally, that's a really, really hard question, because as important as I see any number of these things all playing important roles, DSA, Sanders campaign, variety of different groups and formations. I think even to some extent, like this kind of independent media web. I don't think there's any way of doing this without basically just a mass labor presence. I don't see a left politics that doesn't sort of propel out of that. Now, obviously, when we talk about labor in the 21st century, it's we're talking about how do we organize informal sectors and the freelance economy and redefining work and all of that sort of thing. So there's really big questions and really huge challenges. I think some of it goes back to like what you were saying before, about appealing to this broader group of people. And I think that some of that is going to have to do with definitely things that I think if we can actually just move quickly and get over them, they can not be the same kind of repetitive conversations we have to have. But, letting go of like subcultural practices, like not being kind of like framing our politics as like a small in group with like, insular kind of like ways of being that are relatively narrow in terms of what is going to draw a broader set of people. I think one of the tragedies of this campaign, and even just from an electoral calculation, was that a lot of the energy was in the beginning was around this Sanders Warren thing, and a lot of it did have to do with sort of competing over the PMC, right? We're all like sick of that term. But the truth was that I think Bernie, maybe even before this race, coming into 2020, might have been in a stronger position and could have ran a campaign that really took on Biden's vulnerabilities, both in terms of obvious areas like trade, Medicare, Social Security, but also playing to the anxieties of most Democratic voters, which is really just electability. That is the vast majority of why and how they voted. So I think that, and again, a lot of these things are not really having to do with any real policy differences or core commitments, but certainly a very different rhetorical, strategic approach, because I don't think we're going to reach that kind of much, much broader base of people if, we're not communicating and having space to do that in an effective way.
So I guess there's two different questions. One criticism of the Sanders campaign was on the end of particular tactics, and to some degree questions of rhetoric. And most of these criticisms came from the right, saying, and by the right I just mean kind of liberal journalists and others, saying, okay, why didn't he solicit in more endorsements? Why didn't he, and they made it in that, why didn't he play nicer with some establishment Democratic politicians? And obviously we reject that approach. But one way to frame that in a left-wing sense, and I guess this is more a question for Matt, is, how could we have expected to win the nomination of a party when we were running a candidate that had the support of not even 1/10 of the Democratic caucus in Congress? And I'm not saying this as an indictment of Sanders. It's more of an indictment of what the Democratic Party is. Maybe that's the root of why it was too far to expect this to happen in one election cycle. Or maybe there was something Sanders could have done to get more endorsements and more support, especially considering he was running for the second time.
Well, yeah, I mean, let's try to give a serious answer to this general question. I mean, we need to take a hard look at the landscape here. And I think in some ways, the excitement about Bernie, the premise of Bernie that got me, that, caused me to devote, the entire campaign season 2016, 4 years ago, into thinking about this movement and working for it and writing about it, and then, and continued to sustain me through this entire cycle, is that it differed from so many other left projects that I'd seen in my lifetime, and in that it was a fundamentally majoritarian movement, or at least it had that aspiration. That was the promise. That was the premise of Bernie, that these basic, broad, universal social democratic demands. Medicare for all is like the peak of the pyramid, but there are a whole range of them under them. Have majority support. Bernie didn't in 2016. He didn't create a majority for this. He unveiled it. That was the kind of talking point that we had at the time, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. And going on what Michael said, polls continue to confirm in some ways. This 2020 campaign has only hardened that support at the level of the survey and the level of the one-off policy question. So that was the excitement. But I think in lots of other ways, 2016 gave us a kind of, now we see it in the light of day, in the harder light of day, a little bit of a delusive sense of the actual strength of not necessarily these ideas, but the organizational, the effective power of a kind of electoral movement in the Democratic Party as it exists. Bernie clearly, it seems now, in 2016, got a huge boost of voters who were anti-Clinton voters, who were not entirely, and I don't want to say that those voters are completely, had nothing to do with Bernie's program. I don't think his victory in West Virginia could have been achieved if by literally anyone who wasn't Hillary. I'm not saying that, but clearly a lot of voters who are not part of any kind of, in any kind of committed way, part of a sort of a left nucleus to build forward. So if we were coming out in 2016 saying, hey, look, we have 45% of the Democratic Party electorate, and mark it down, that's wrong. But that we saw this year how not just institutionally, but even on the ground, the sort of determined, committed support for Bernie is not at that level. On the other hand, what we did find out is it is quite substantial. And Bernie's support in 2020, even though it wasn't enough to win, it wasn't enough to build that majority. I think we have a clearer picture of where our strengths and where our weaknesses are, sort of in hard numbers. We know we still have a lot of work to win over Black voters, for instance, Black voters in the South. We know we have a lot of work to win over older voters. And we know that the Democratic Party, and maybe we come back to this, is changing in some ways for the better and in some ways for the worse. We know the influx of wealthy, older suburbanites who were turned Democrat after Trump's election and were hewed into becoming the sort of the vanguard coalition of the Pelosi-Schumer Democratic Party in the 2018 midterms. We know that those voters showed up and turned out strongly against Bernie and will continue to show up and turn out strongly against anything that we attempt to do within the party going forward. That said, and Connor Kilpatrick's article that dropped today at Jacobin gets into this, we also know we have a better measure of our strength. We have a better measure of our strength among young voters above all, but not just millennials or voters under 25 or something, voters under 45, voters under 50 even, really strong support. And we know we have strong support from Latino voters in certain concentrated areas. And in terms of the way forward, one concrete thing, I was just looking at the California results again today, and I'll shut up after this, but there were 13 congressional districts in California where Bernie had over 40% of the vote. There were 5 in which he had 49% of the vote, all in Southern California, all over 2/3 Latino. And they, in every case, turnout in those districts was higher than it was in 2016. Turnout for Bernie was higher, even though it was a multi-candidate race. Still, Bernie got more votes and a higher share of the vote than he had when he was running against Hillary in 2016. These are districts that we should know a lot more about right now. These are working class districts, first of all, and this broader movement needs to sort of reckon with where our strength is and where our strength isn't. That doesn't mean to ignore where our strength isn't, but it does mean to sort of more consciously, even than we've yet done, I think, focus on where our strength is over the next in the short and medium term.
Yeah, I completely agree with Matt. And also, like on Super Tuesday, I was here in California where I live. I live in the Bay Area, and it was obviously a really disappointing result across the country, but we had an enormous party and it was a very jubilant occasion where I was. And by the end of the night, I was sort of joking that once the results really started to come in, I was sort of joking that I'm never leaving California. And to be honest, though, I mean, this has become a little bit less of a joke. I mean, maybe one day I'll leave California, but like, this has just factored into the decision making for me and my partner in terms of where to move next. And like, we're moving to Los Angeles. There are other reasons for that, but also like, we really do as socialists need to be focusing on places where we don't necessarily have tons of people or tons of information, but Bernie Sanders has given us a map. I mean, it's revealed for us. Like, it's sort of like this metaphor that I've been using for a lot of things lately is this concept of a dye tracing. It's like this, strategy that they use in a watershed analysis where they pour dye into a river, and you can sort of, what looked previously like a river, you can now see the patterns, right? I almost feel like the Bernie Sanders campaign is that for the electorate. So we can see where we have bastions of left-wing support or potential left-wing support, and we can see where we need to, put a lot of effort to simply get a foothold, and we can see where we already have a foothold, and we need to be putting in effort to build up institutions. So don't worry, guys, I'll take care of it. I'm going to Southern California. No, but in all honesty, I did want to say that I think that's true, that we can look at the map and focus on where we need to pay attention. And I also wanted to back up to a separate question about why we didn't perform better with, why we expected to perform even decently, considering that the vast majority of the Democratic Party establishment has no real interest in our candidate and our movement, or are actively hostile to it. I think that we thought that the Democratic Party's base was fed up enough with the establishment that we could override it. And this is somewhat similar to my previous comment about, learning good information from this grand adventure. One bit of information is that it matters what segments of the base you have as a part of your coalition. So I think that Bernie Sanders has the same number, or probably more passionate and active supporters in his base than Joe Biden and the rest of the centrists combined. But Bernie Sanders has less establishment support. And this matters because the establishment support as actually refers to people who have institutional contacts and influence channels that allow them to influence all the other people who are not active supporters of any candidate, the kinds of people who make up their mind within a few days of going to the polls. So I feel like I've learned a lot more just through this whole thing about how that works, and specifically the relationship between the Democratic Party establishment and mainstream media, and how people are really waiting to hear. People, I think, are politically incoherent. I think that you can tell a person something for the most part, and I've learned this through canvassing, if they're not already very politically invested already, you can tell a person a thing, and if there's a kernel of truth in it, they will shake their heads and be like, yeah, that totally makes sense. And if the next person comes along and tells them something else that has a kernel of truth in it, a lot of people the same people will shake their heads and be like, yeah, that makes sense. So if you tell someone, hey, we really need to get Trump out of office, Joe Biden's the most electable because, he was the vice president, they'll be like, damn, that seems accurate. And if you come along to the same person and you're like, hey, working people have been screwed over for decades, wages have been stagnating while profits have been skyrocketing, we really got to change that. They'll be like, man, that's really true. People can think both of these things at once. So it matters who's reaching them. And Bernie Sanders has an incredible field operation. I don't think that we can fault the campaign on that front. I think that, obviously he was losing in places where Joe Biden had basically no field operation. He was losing to Joe Biden. So I think that we can't underestimate the importance of the mainstream media. And I think the media was doing, not sort of like in a sort of dumb or reductive or simplistic way, doing the bidding of, but very much collaborating with, perhaps somewhat accidentally, just because they're pursuing their shared interests, with the elements of the Democratic Party establishment that were hostile to our candidate. And it made a big difference when it came to a different, less engaged section of the base.
Michael, how much do we blame the media? I want to. I hate those people. Right. Except those paying me to write columns. They're right.
They're good. They do a good job. They're great people. Yeah. Well, here's my thing: is that even if it is 95% the media's fault, we have to focus on the 5% that we have control over. So I think that that's true. You have to know the terrain you're in. But I guess this, just as an example, I don't totally agree. I think the problem with the Bernie campaign on a campaign level, in addition to kind of the woke contest with Elizabeth Warren on Twitter and all of that, was the message and the policy is great and it's really clear. It is like a complete the New Deal message, and it's not revolutionary. And I don't care. I'm not attached to verbiage one way or another. But I think that there was at times a little bit of a contradiction in terms of how bold the rhetoric could get versus normal campaigning, campaign against Elizabeth Warren in the beginning, or have a campaign against Biden that lasts for several months, putting him on the spot on particularly trade. And the last thing I'd say real quick, just going back to the beginning, and this absolutely could have failed 100%. But I guess I can't assume, there's no way that Bernie is going to get Jim Clyburn to endorse him, right? Obviously. But I also think when you're playing the game like, because you're running for president and you're dealing with these fucking people in a primary. And the same thing with the press. Like, the press is terrible. They're ridiculous. And they are always going to be biased against Bernie. But you still have to the extent it is humanly possible, try to ameliorate that. And I don't know. Like, I don't know what more they could have done. I think at a certain point in the primary, like after Nevada, maybe he starts to shift his rhetoric up a little bit. But I do think overall, this was a exercise in institutions really overwhelming the campaign, unfortunately.
So we are joined now by Amber Frost, who's fixing getting her audio working. So this was a terrible time to intro someone. I'm not an expert like at this, like, you know, my man Michael Brooks here, but I do know Michael has to run in a few. We have a big announcement that we're going to drop today. Was going to get overshadowed a bit, but Michael's going to be doing some YouTube shows, including a new show we're going to be talking about tomorrow. It's going to debut this weekend on Saturday. So thanks for your time, Michael.
And the thing on Friday with Adolf, I'm really excited about.
Oh yes, and also
Plug
we're doing
that.
an event with Cedric Johnson, Adolf Reed. Who else is in that event? Willie Leggett.
I think so.
And Michael talking about some of these issues and talking about the big question of what the hell happened in South Carolina and what lessons we draw from it, because we need to draw some lessons from it, but we can't draw the wrong ones. But anyway,
Thanks, man.
See you later, Michael.
Take care, guys.
And now we're joined by Amber Frost. And Amber, I've known since, I guess, the YDSA, YDS days back over a decade ago, back when DSA was like Frank Llewellyn, me, you, David Dualde, and a very sad, tiny, windowless office. But
God, yeah, that was awful.
So does that give you some perspective or some hope about where we are now compared to then, or are you as depressed as the rest of us?
Well, you can hear me, right? Okay. Well, yeah, it's not a good day. First of all, cheers, ladies. Long live Bernie.
To Bernie.
So I have like a brief spiel that I'll run through real quick. First of all, you know, proud of you all for your hard work. Proud to work alongside you. I think everyone here kind of knew that this was the most likely outcome. Doesn't make it hurt less. It was always a slim chance, but it was the biggest slim chance we've had in our lifetimes, and maybe the biggest one we ever had. Let's hope not. But I assume there's probably some smug gloating from the armchair revolutionaries right now, saying, "Well, I told you this was going to happen." But we knew it was a long shot. But while most of our work is always sort of like a long, slow, unsexy slog, some of it is keeping an eye out for random opportunities that chaotically fall from the sky into your lap, and trying to evaluate whether those opportunities have any promise. And if they do, you chase them down to the very end. And that's what Bernie was. So you can't be scared of failure. So ever onward. Some great things sort of became obvious to some people that have always been obvious to us. What Bernie did right was focus on bread and butter issues: jobs, wages, healthcare, unions, housing, education, etc. I think you could say a lot of factors contributed to the defeat of his campaign. It is, of course, fair to say Bernie made some mistakes, and his staff certainly did too, particularly when they departed from the bread and butter issues to sort of like liberal social justice stuff that only really appeals to liberals that were never going to vote for him anyway. That said, he mostly stayed on message and played the hits under very extreme scrutiny by a lot of fake friends. Corona certainly exacerbated the already egregious voter suppression in the country. But the big one was obviously massive sabotage from a hostile Democratic Party, who I'm not even sure at this point you could call the left wing of Capitol anymore. I've never been sanguine on the utility of the Democratic Party anyway. I still think it was worth the shot. Probably wouldn't try it again. Who knows? I won't be voting for Biden, but I think these conversations tend to focus too much on, voting or not voting, and what to do about the Democratic Party, and et cetera, whatever. I don't really want to talk about Democratic Party too much right now, who I despise and will burn in hell. But I think it makes sense to focus on sort of moving forward. So obviously, everyone in this chat is like a lifer. But I will say I do worry about some people who just cut their teeth on the Sanders campaign, which is a ton of people, specifically because I've observed in my time in politics and from just sort of historical observation, two very distinct post-68 tendencies that usually follow a defeat, triumphalism and despair. The despair is obvious, and it sometimes results in a complete withdrawal from politics, but not as often as I think people would assume. It usually doesn't have people just quit and never come back. I think a lot of it, if not most of it, tends to result into a sort of retreat into very small, regionally specific feel-good projects that have a higher likelihood of success. It's a lot of low-stakes stuff, local electorals, or even more anarchisty, like mutual aid, vegan potluck bullshit. I would say that you should do charity work and volunteer because it's psychologically good for your health and it's socially and culturally fortifying. But that's not politics, it's like church. But maybe, more leftists should join a church. I'm not being facetious. It could help you differentiate, political work from being a part of a community and just being a good person and a good neighbor. But I'm not really a do-gooder, I'm a socialist. But equally useless, and I think far less commented on, is the triumphalism. And I know Bhaskar has seen this. Post-Occupy, it was actually upsetting. I believe it's kind of like a 60s boomer hangover that we just can't seem to shake. I think people can't deal with defeat, so they assume this sort of psychotic denialism and try to just spin it as something less than a defeat, or oh, what if the real people's revolution was the friends we made along the way, or some bullshit like that. It's delusional, and it prevents serious considerations about material politics. It's also dangerously obnoxious. In that it alienates normal people for whom politics are not a hobby or an identity, but a means to an end, and nothing more than the civic space of material concerns. So my response to all of that stuff tended to be oh, so this is really nice you found a community of activists and all this, but I don't really give a shit. I want socialized healthcare. I already have friends. So I think it's important to come through and say no, this is a defeat and it's sad. And I'm sorry, there's no magic left coalition that's going to rise out of this ashes. There's maybe a little copper wire we can strip from the Bernie movement, and we definitely should on our way out. But mostly we're left with Bupkis, and we'll be starting over again, mostly from scratch. Which brings me to where to go from here. So for me, it's back to labor. My most immediate interest is in the Teamster struggle, still a very powerful industry that can't be shut down or outsourced. Essential workers too. My larger commitments are that I'd like to somehow continue helping labor campaign for single-payer healthcare. It's obviously very difficult to be a trade unionist in America because for me, I'm not even in a union, but also union density has been decimated. Labor's been hollowed out and cannibalized by capital and the Democratic Party for years, but that is the challenge. When you say, well, I think the path is labor, a lot of the response tends to be, well, yeah, but labor is weak. And it's yeah, I know. They do not, sorry, it's going to be hard. We have a very difficult path. That's just what it is. But I don't know, there's a slight relief because to me, the Bernie phenomenon was kind of a pain in the ass. I never really liked electoral politics or saw them as the most likely path to worker power anyway. Like I said, I still think it was worth a shot. I'm proud of everything we did, and I think it was the thing to do at the time. But I'm a vulgar workerist through and through, and I've always said it's most likely that we're not going to get a shortcut around that slow, unsexy work of labor organizing. That said, you don't turn down a chance like Bernie. So we're back to working for a paycheck, but doesn't mean we're not going to play the lottery. But the universe is a chaotic place, and maybe we'll get lucky again. On a personal note, I'm very sad and very angry, like everyone else. But triumphalism is very alienating, with this delusional optimism. And despair is just like lazy and cowardly, and both are equally useless. So now is the time for stoicism and serious-minded considerations for the future. So I don't have to tell you guys that are on this, but if you're watching, I'm sad and angry with you. So let's have our drunken cry, and then
Yeah. And now
suck it up, Buttercup, because this is what we sign up for. And sometimes with providence, vigilance, and loyalty, you win. So glad you're here. Hope you stay.
Yeah, and also now we are a little bit more unrestrained by party discipline. We could say things like, fuck Elizabeth Warren and our whole crew.
Fuck her.
As
Fuck
a
her.
your label and as a motherfucking crew. Yeah, all those things are terrible. Even Andrew Yang was terrible. I had to pretend to like Andrew Yang for like 6 days, try to win over voters.
He had a weird little face.
Okay, but here's where I would disagree with you on one part, which is just, all right. Yes, we didn't. This wasn't. I'll give a bad football analogy. This wasn't a scoring drive, but sometimes we had the ball backed up in our own end zone, and we got the ball into good field position. So next time we get the ball back, maybe we'll have a shot. Like, at least I think that there was obviously progress made. We went from being completely marginal to being a force that's not large enough to win a national election, but still existent, right?
I think that's very fortifying, and I agree with that. But I think people, I love, for example, like Mark Fisher, but where I disagree with a lot of his analysis is that he uses that old like Jameson quote about how it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capital. I don't actually think that it's a failure of imagination that's slowing us down. I do think it gives us a shot in the arm to be like, look at all these people invigorated. But it's also like very dispiriting to be like, well, look at all of these people invigorated, focused, working very hard, and yet we still got shut down. So it kind of cuts both ways. That said, it does kind of, I think, prove the fact that actually this was in our grasp all along. There's no secret, people's whisperer. There's no secret words. You don't actually have to chase whatever zeitgeist there is. What we've been saying for quite some time, and I think that I was pretty confident about, but am now so much more confident about, is that actually people do believe that something better is possible, and they do believe that these things are plausible, and they do have, I think, good priorities and good instincts. We just had to do the most basic thing that no one, particularly the Democratic Party, was doing for so long. We just had to be like, look, this is the plan. We have these, instituting basic social democratic reforms is the way to mass appeal. So I think the main thing going forward for people on the quote unquote left, whatever that, there's no left in America, but is to just be like, look, we saw what worked. We saw what galvanized people. They're not actually disaffected and unwilling to participate. They're not hopeless. The affliction of the perpetually lumpen masses is largely overstated. It's actually pretty easy to wake people up if you have one, honest leadership, and 2, a clear message, and 3, just very basic social democratic program.
So for Matt and Meagan, to bring them into the conversation, I guess one of my questions is, okay, does the gains we made on all these individual policy points matter as far as a basis for future organizing? Does it matter that, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, that support in America for Medicare for all went from 50% to 40%? and people hate insurance companies even more and hate bankers even more and are, we're attracted to Bernie's core policy points. Does that matter? Then also at an institutional level, since it seems like we have one, well, it doesn't seem like we have one national level politician that's popular in Bernie Sanders. We don't really have anything of a bench at all. What role do we need Bernie to play if we're going to form a new institution? Like, I'm not talking about a socialist party or anything. I'm talking at the very least about something that merges broadly the kind of sentiments that initially inspired our revolution and the wing of DSA that really wants to impact mass politics, and reform caucuses and unions and left-wing union leaderships, and whatever, however you want to define that. Because I agree with Amber that it's small, but that's the left we have, the materialist left that's kind of concerned about improving things. So I don't know. I'll let you guys. I'm not really moderating this thing, so you guys just say some things. We have 15 minutes to fill up. I want some airtime.
All right.
I can start with just the first thing about like what's the role of an expanded imagination. I mean, Amber's completely right that like we don't, as materialists, believe that the world changes as a result of the changes in people's ideas. It's not like an automatic mechanism at all. And in fact, liberals very much believe that hearts and minds are the mechanism by which you change the world, and we reject that. And we're often in a position to argue otherwise. But it's also the case that when people have their expectations raised and they're feeling more confident, then they maneuver themselves into different positions, which allows them to fight differently, right? And that actually sets different material processes in motion. So ultimately, imagination has a role to play in the, sort of like larger material forces of history. And ultimately, the reason I'm saying this is because I think that we can all kind of agree that the main victory here is that imaginative victory. Like, we don't have really anything else to show for this besides people believe that different things are possible in our society now than they believed 5 years ago before Bernie Sanders started running for president. And I think that's really true. I mean, I think that when you look at the polls and the surveys that are showing how popular his platform is, that's just indicative of that broader phenomenon, which is that I feel that there was a spell cast over people in the 1980s, and is this spell that Mark Fisher calls capitalist realism, the idea that there genuinely is no alternative. All of the other possibilities besides the present situation have been completely foreclosed upon. And your job as an individual is to just navigate around it and try to set up a decent life for yourself. And I think that's changed, actually. I don't think it's all down to Bernie Sanders. I mean, I think that Donald Trump, in a way, is actually symptomatic of some of that change as well. So it started before him, but he was capable of stepping up and providing electoral leadership at a moment when it was possible, alongside Donald Trump, actually, bizarrely. And we're very lucky that we had a left pole when there was a right populist pole. And we really are. We really need to stop for a moment and think about how bad it would be if there was only a right populist pole and not a left populist pole over the last 5 years. We're in a much better position than we would have been otherwise. And I think that, yeah, we have this sort of expanded imagination about what's possible, even if it's just an expanded imagination about what kinds of social democratic programs we would like to implement in our capitalist state. And we hear a lot of grumblings from people who themselves are not necessarily socialists, who tell us that Bernie Sanders is not a socialist, and they would like to disabuse us of this notion. This is a running theme. And it's obviously kind of obnoxious because whatever's in Bernie's heart, this is arguably the exact way that a socialist should behave in the beating heart of global capitalism, right? Is expanding people's imagination to the extent that it is possible to get them to believe that we can have things like single-payer healthcare at the very least in this country as a launching pad for building people's confidence. And like I said at the beginning of this comment, convincing them to maneuver themselves into different formations from which they can act politically. And I mean that, for example, like convincing people that instead of just like moping around and thinking that things suck, they should like become an activist in their union, or that they should go join a socialist organization and get serious about political education and like work on some electoral campaign or something like that. Who knows what the combinations will be, but I do think there's a role for raised expectations in all of that. And if that's the only thing that we won from this whole adventure, then I don't think that it's nothing necessarily, even though I agree with Amber that we shouldn't be too triumphalist and we shouldn't play it up too much at the same time.
If that's the only thing that we want from this venture, I'm blowing my brains out.
But even when it comes to
I think we agree, though, like basically that raised expectations are a good thing. My only argument is that, see, there was like, I think in terms of like 90s sort of journalistic ideas where they were like, man, if people only knew, and it's like, well, now people do know, but they don't really feel like they could do anything about it, so it's almost worse than useless. I don't think it's hopeless. I do like that the enthusiasm around this stuff has been raised. I don't know how we're going to hold on to that. I think it'll be possible. I hope that we can use sort of historic moment to make it work. But I think Fisher really overestimated the degree to which people's sort of like political torpor was the issue that was holding us back, that it was some sort of failure of will or of imagination. I think it's actually pretty easy, what we learned from this, to get people excited about stuff.
Well, yeah, it's a matter of kind of class forces and people actually feeling like politics can make a difference in their lives, which we briefly were able to show them. And I'll throw it to Matt, but one thought that I did have was that in my constitution, I'm kind of a let's slowly build the workers' movement over the course of 60 years and not really engage in elections person. But to me, the Sanders campaign, if anything, taught me the opposite lesson, which is that actually this left populist kind of gamble kind of almost worked, right? We have no institutions, we had no basis, and we were almost able to capture the presidency and then use that bully pulpit to build institutions. We were almost able to reverse engineer politics.
We almost got in the back door.
Yeah, exactly.
Who knows? That could happen. Like, weird things happen. You should keep an eye out for those chaos options.
Yeah. Matt Karp, give me some wisdom. Oh, you're muted, man. You got to give me.
We are all. Oh, thanks, Amber, for reminding me to pour up a Pinot tonight. We're all Pinot Grigio girls this evening, and let's not forget that.
Highlight girl.
But look, okay, on this question of imagination versus materiality, I mean, I guess I'm going to do a very characteristic thing and find some kind of synthetic middle ground here or something, because I think on one level there's the specific kind of imagination that did emerge from the 5 years of Sandersism. If you compare the left, even like the post-Occupy left of the early 2010s to now, it's a material imagination, if you will. And I don't think we had that in 2014 or 2015. I don't think we had a sense. I don't think, Amber, you could even sit here and be so confident that the bread and butter social democratic healthcare, labor, jobs kind of force was actually the true strength of the left. And I think we kind of know that. Again, we've relearned that even among ourselves. And I think the polls bear that out. And we're a long way from having the organizational power to deliver that. We're a long fucking way from that. But even knowing that that's kind of the horizon is a huge step from where the left or where any kind of working class politics was before that. And then just as a small little kind of bitter maraschino cherry topped on that Sunday, there is some evidence that even none of us here really want to admit it, but there is some evidence that even at the state level, a very little bit of kind of left populist energy, left electoral energy can go a long way if you look at the New York legislature this year, which still sucks, which still totally fucking sucks and just did a shitty, horrible austerity budget in the middle of a pandemic. And there are class and kind of coalition reasons why we shouldn't be triumphant about like, oh, we're making all the Democrats, we're making all the Democrats socialists now. But even a little bit of this energy injected at the state level did produce a $15 minimum wage in New York City, did produce, significant progress on housing and rent stuff in New York, has produced at least some signs that this process can be moved by this energy. And if you think from the perspective of not that we were this close to the presidency, which maybe we were with this moonshot, or maybe we weren't, but if you think rather from our material weakness, we have, as Dustin Costello is always saying, we have what 0.01% of all elected officials in this country. We have no actual material strength. The idea that if you reckon the impact that we've had with the actual weakness of the really existing movement, to me, it suggests that there's a lot more we can do, even if it's bit by bit. And my like little historical, stupid, optimistic analogy is, the anti-slavery movement, which, yeah, you don't. The nature of winning and losing is you don't, in some ways, with a cause like this, you don't win until you fucking win, and until you do that, you're just always going to be losing. You're just always going to be losing, and so there's no like, oh, I mean, yeah, maybe Bhaskar, we got it to the 40-yard line and we buried them in the, into their own, deep in their own zone or something like that. But you still lost. But you don't win until you win. And to know that there is a social democratic majority, a slumbering giant out there, that it's our fault if we can't reach it and we can't help grow it. That's a significant gain that I don't think I could have sat here and told you that in 2015 and felt any confidence in feeling that.
Yeah, I mean, we had the best player in the league and we still lost, which tells you something about our class forces. Whereas the fucking Giants, my Giants won twice with Eli Manning as quarterback. That's what you need. You need a movement capable of winning with Eli Manning as quarterback. And
Did you just make Bernie Sanders Tom Brady?
As a Patriots fan from like the Miller era, I actually do appreciate that.
I think we should end this at 7 because this can go on. I'm not going to take questions from the Q&A. We got a mob out. There's too many people on this Q&A for this to be proper Soviet democracy. We'll have to settle for bourgeois democracy tonight. But just before I let everyone do a last kind of round of words, just as a reminder, this isn't the radio, so I don't need to tell you what you're watching or listening to, right? Because you can see it on your screen. But tomorrow night, we're on at 6 p.m. We have Sia Weaver talking about why we need universal rent control and why it's not only good policy, in other words, debunking some of the neoliberal things they'll say about universal rent control, why it needs to be one of a litmus test of sorts for socialist candidates to support rent control, and also combined with that, the construction of new public housing stock. So Karen Narevsky and Sia Weaver are going to be on chatting with that tomorrow, and then we're on basically every day at 6 p.m. Onward. We're not asking for your money until November or December. When we do in November and December, please give us your money. In the meantime, just press subscribe to the YouTube channel. But I'll leave it there. Meagan, you have some thoughts? You're also muted. Oh,
I have a million thoughts and they're all running through my head at the same time. I was impressed that I was able to pluck some of them out in the course of this hour. I guess a final thing is like the main question for me going forward is there anything that Bernie Sanders' campaign should have really done differently that would have resulted in a fundamentally different outcome? I'm going to be mulling over that for weeks, months, possibly the rest of my life. But I guess one thing that's really coming up for me is the fact that I don't think that the Democratic Party actually planned to win precisely how they did. I actually think that they fell face first into a victory here. And so we shouldn't maybe walk away with we shouldn't allow ourselves to draw too simple of a conclusion that the institution of the Democratic Party was too smart for us or too strong for us. I think maybe it was too accidentally coordinated for us, if that makes sense. If you have a bunch of different actors that all have the same set of craven self-interests, then ultimately, at the end of the day, under extreme pressure, they often tend to coincide with each other. They reach agreements behind closed doors because I can do something for you and you can do something for me. I kind of think that's what happened here. I think that, Amy and Pete realized that they could, drop out in exchange for something from Biden that would help him, he would help them. These are the kinds of backroom deals that led to the actual outcome, which was ultimately really hard to surmount. That we'll remember forever this very unprecedented event, which I've been calling the Great Consolidation in my head. I've never seen anything like it before. And that's really what took us down. I'm not necessarily sure that anything that I can think of that we would have done or could have reasonably overcome it. It may just be a reflection on the balance of forces that are currently in existence. That's my last thought for today. More to come.
Amber, you kind of gave this earlier, but what's one constructive thing that a socialist can do that's despairing right now? You said get involved, get looped in somehow in Medicare for All campaigns, in labor organizing. Give us something constructive.
Well, I do want to go back to what Meagan said, is that I do think too that if you are despairing, it is also helpful to remember, and I think she sort of touched on this, but no one really wants to use this word because our entire strategy is based on reducing the amount that we have to depend on this word. But there is a certain amount of luck, and you should definitely like analyze your mistakes. But like we also, some of it is luck. I mean, Bernie was luck too. Like again, like Bhaskar and I are both the, slowly build things, but then Bernie happened. We're like, well, fuck, maybe we can, maybe this is a foothold. Not turning this down, maybe we could sneak in through the back door. Maybe there is a shortcut, and it was worth it. It was worth the effort. I'll sleep good at night knowing I did everything I could. And I think Meagan is definitely correct that you can't like actually overestimate the Democratic machine. I mean, they are a massive, powerful force, but also clearly they're not very competent. They did kind of get lucky, and we did kind of get unlucky. Now, granted, our strategy has to, factor for that moving forward. We have to think that not everything's going to be on our side. We're not, even if we do everything right, sometimes you lose anyway. That is what it is. But let's just, there is a certain random chaos at play, but you keep going anyway. The one thing I would like to end on is this idea of the end of history, and all of these people who were saying history is back, baby. The inevitability of liberal capitalism is no longer. I sort of, I was on that tip for quite some while. But then I don't know, I just want to consider this possibility that maybe it was just a very small number of us that actually even believed that anyway. Maybe for the whole slumbering giant thing, maybe they weren't even slumbering. Maybe they were just waiting for someone else to say, we could have it better. Maybe the idea that people had this extremely limited imagination came from a very cynical kind of, leftist reading of what people's expectations were. Because it turns out it wasn't actually that hard to raise people's standards. It literally took one guy being like, what about Medicare for All? And not the most charismatic guy, not the most, just one screaming Jew. And people were like, yeah, I like him. I think, if anything, one of the best things about the Bernie campaign is that it maybe proved to the sorts of people like us who spend an inordinate amount of time thinking about politics because we're fucking freaks. I think we should look at people differently and be like, actually, they are really rational, and they're more rational than leftists. We'll put it that way. They're reasonable, and they're not, despairing lumpen. It was the end of history. Nobody told them, apparently. I don't think they ever paid attention to that shit in the first place. It was so easy to raise their standards and expand the boundaries of their imagination. It's almost embarrassing to the left that we didn't do it earlier.
Yeah, why didn't we think it earlier? Yeah, we were willing to, I as a young high schooler was a Dick Gephardt man because I had read one book of Marx, and I was like, well, the organized working class, as flawed as it is with the AFL-CIO, and therefore it must be with Dick Gephardt. Just kidding, not really. But I really hated Howard Dean, which was, a good early sign. Howard Dean sucks. Matt Karp, some thoughts, some words, final words.
Yeah, well, we're at 7. I'm going to be brief. I'm just going to say I agree. This in some ways, I think the further we get from this, the more we're going to see given our institutional weakness here in this moment, and given the balance of class forces, what a moonshot the Bernie campaign was. What a beautiful, gorgeous moonshot it was. And, you know, we missed the moon this time. But, you know, the thing about the moon is it cycles. It goes away and then it comes back. And it's going to come back and we're going to catch it. Okay.
Okay. Well, that was like a high school guidance counselor.
I love it.
It was nice. It was nice. Well, you know, I would say this, you know, Bernie Sanders, this is one thing I feared about him, but it is kind of beautiful as a consolation, is that he's going to be remembered like Martin Luther King, like Eugene Debs, like Mother Jones, like these generations of American radicals that have been voices of moral conscience, that have been ahead of their time, that have paved the way for something else. I didn't really want him to be that. I wanted him to be fucking Lenin. I wanted him to take power and institute change. I wanted him to be flawed. I wanted to feel betrayed by Bernie Sanders. I actually wanted him to be mucked up by all the messiness and compromises of state power. But instead, you know, we got Martin Luther King, we got Eugene Debs, and I think he should be proud of what he's accomplished. The rest of us should maybe at some point do some self-criticism sessions about how we let down the dear leader. But in the meantime, you know, I think at the very least, we should think about this as a struggle that will last a long time. The founder of DSA, Michael Harrington, used to say we shouldn't be sprinters, we should be long distance runners. So hopefully you all will join us into, you know, that race and you know, stick with this politics for the long run, because the solution to our problems might not be in this or that particular program or candidate, but it's in politics in general. It's in organizing to get power away from the powerful and to give it to the people who need it. All right. Good night, everyone. Thanks for
Good night, everyone. Thank you, dear leader.
Thanks.
Thank you. Long live Bernie.
Member Matt.
Long live Bernie.
On.
Yeah, long live Bernie.
Cale Brooks. You know, Cale has done a really good job of producing these things behind the scenes. So, and you know, struggle continues.
Thank you.